Trigger warning. Today's episode is a discussion of sexual assault, gender-based violence, rape culture, and other violence that can be emotionally triggering to some individuals. This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We want to welcome you to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square, and we're glad we've intersected with you today. My name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
He does indeed. And my name is Kevin George, and I am the Dean and Rector at St. Paul's Cathedral, also here in London, Ontario.
All right, Kevin, it's our 10th season. How we got here. It's a miracle, brother.
It's a miracle.
But we did
It is a miracle.
We did it. That's great.
Yeah.
No, we've had a great run so far, and it's our second episode. And we are honored to continue this 10th season with a very special guest, a return guest to the Vicar's Crossing, who was here a couple of years ago. And today we're welcoming Dr. Danielle Tumminio-Hansen to the podcast. So it's great to have Danielle back with us again. So by way of introduction, let me tell you a little bit about her. She has over 15 years of experience as a writer, public theologian, and faith leader. She is a 3-time Ivy League graduate, a former lecturer at Yale and Tufts University, and the author of numerous works on the intersection of spirituality and contemporary culture. And she currently works as a professor at Emory University. Now, her latest book is what we'll be talking about mostly today, and it comes out March the 19th. And the title of the book is Speaking of Rape, The Limits of Language in Sexual Violations. And in this book, Danielle steps into really a space of the seemingly unspeakable, and she offers some really fresh language and perspective to speaking and listening that really reframe how we speak about, discuss, and address rape. And this is a really groundbreaking piece of work. So we'll be looking forward to talking to Danielle about this latest offering of hers. And just want to acknowledge to our listeners, everybody tuned in, that and offer a little bit of a trigger warning at the outset here. Today's discussion might be difficult for victims of sexual violence, so we offer that and really do want you to be mindful of that and to take care of yourself. So please keep that in mind.
Thank you, Rob. And we also, of course, as we begin our podcast today, acknowledge that the grounds from whence, is that right? From whence? From whence we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples. These are lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society, and people with whom we wish to walk the two-row path towards reconciliation. So each of us in our own way, seeking to find ways that we have benefited disproportionately for no other reason than white supremacy, and at the same time trying to find ways to engage in the work that is necessary for reconciliation.
A big thank you, as always, to our wonderful sponsors on the Vicar's Crossing. We want to say hello and thanks to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. And our thanks again to Dave Mullen, and a big hello to everybody at A. Miller George today.
Hello over there, folks. And to the Diocese of Huron. The Diocese of Huron, as I like to say, a place that keeps me and Rob employed. We're thankful for that little gift as well. A community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, from Grand Bend to Port Rowan, and all points in between come together to worship and to serve. We offer our gratitude to Bishop Todd Townsend and all of those working to keep the church moving forward.
And to our good friends at Molly Maid in London, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Saying hi to Tricia Lister, and with appreciation for your support, Tricia.
All right. Well, Rob, I think we should have Danielle knocking on our door here very soon.
Okay. All right.
Should we let her in? I think we let her in.
I think we should.
Look at a
We
very,
should
very
right
important
now.
conversation today. So here we go. Here's Danielle.
And Danielle is here, back again with the Vickers Crossing podcast. Welcome back, Danielle. It's been a couple of years since we've had a chance to be together, but we're so glad you could join us again. How are you?
Thank you. It's so lovely to be with you. And it's a lovely day here in Atlanta. So things are good.
Good. Excellent. Excellent.
Well, it's a lovely day here in London too, but it's not as warm as it is in Atlanta.
No, not at all.
We have that wintry feel today. So, which, as we were saying, sort of before we were recording, this mild winter is a little odd. It's been, but quite nice. Yesterday, I was out doing Ashes to Go. Out on a street corner here, and in the sun, it actually was quite lovely. It was, I didn't completely freeze, although I got to say, after an hour, my little paws were getting pretty cold. So, but anyway, look, we're glad you're here. The book is coming out on March the 19th. Speaking of rape, and we were fortunate that you were able to send us a digital copy to review, and it is such an incredibly important book. Critically important, that's too often avoided, I think. Certainly in church circles where Rob and I hang out, and you hang out too, I know, Danielle, it's a bit taboo, which is an odd thing given our history and the ways in which we've participated in sexual violence and have been the perpetrators of violence upon others. But I really do, what I really appreciated about your book was your candor and your honesty. Because for you, this is just it's not just an academic endeavor, right? It's a deeply personal one as you disclose your own story and you share your own pain as a person who experienced sexual violence. Just a little quote from the book you write: "I would do the reader a disservice if I were to undertake this work without reference to those experiences." Speaking of your own. In this way, my method of writing differs from that of many academics, especially in fields like theology, where the standard is to refrain from using the first person, either because one believes it dilutes scholarship or because one sees personal disclosure as a distraction from addressing the needs of the reader. In addition, best practices in my own field of practical theology and pastoral care often discourage caregivers from disclosing personal experiences during a caregiving conversation. All of those things are true, and yet you decided that this was the right thing to do, and I'm glad you did. I wonder if you can say more to our listeners about why the disclosure and the telling of your story is so important for this work.
Sure. So I think that one of the things that was really important to me in my own journey of my life and then my journey to writing the book was the process of moving from really struggling to describe what happened to recognizing that my own embodied reaction of something is deeply wrong here, and I'm having all of these symptoms of something wrong having happened without a word to describe it, moving from that place into a place of, oh, this actually falls under a category of sexual violence, and I didn't realize it because it didn't fit the scripts or the assumptions of what we have about harm. That journey for me of moving from, I don't think there's anything to talk about here, so I'm not talking, to, oh, there actually is something important to talk about, and actually I have to talk about it for my own wellness. Became really relevant when I realized that so many other people have experiences that are like mine. So when I started looking at the literature, what I found were shockingly high numbers of what a psychologist named Mary Koss calls unacknowledged rape survivors. And those numbers are oftentimes well over 50% on college campuses. They're closer to 70%. In the general population, at least in the United States, they're somewhere around 60-65%. And so for me, it became really important to say, there are probably a lot of people who have stories that look quite a bit like mine. And it's really important to provide some context for those stories. And if you don't have, you know, the stories already of people pulling on that or having that journey, you have to get those stories from somewhere. And so, so I felt like it was important for me to share my experience, to give something concrete for the reader to latch onto. I also think, as an academic, it is really important for us to do the reader the service of saying who we are to the extent that who we are affects our scholarship.
Right.
And and the way that I'm going to do this work and the way I'm going to write about this topic is just going to look different, and it's going to come from a different point of view than if I had a different set of experiences. And I think if I wasn't transparent about that, the reader wouldn't be getting the full scope of what there is to consider in the work, because in some ways they wouldn't know what was at stake for me in doing the project and some of what was going through my mind. So that became really really important. Another reason that I thought it was necessary to put in. And then the final reason is that the books that were most impactful to me were the ones that did take that step to write with reference to personal experience. And so when I looked and said, what are some of the best works in the field, the ones that I felt really kind of had the strongest impact were the ones that took those risks. And so so that became kind of the third reason, that when I thought what will probably help the reader most, you know, just totally selfishly projecting, I thought, well, it might be what helped me most.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I have to say that I think the genuineness of it all comes through. And I do believe you're right that, you know, academically, it would be disingenuous for you to try and tell this story without acknowledging your very real involvement, your very real pain, your very real experience. You also raised an interesting point around the fact that we're all raised with stereotypes, myths, and scripts about what constitutes a real rape, right? And I was thinking about this in the context, I don't know if you've seen this in the news in Atlanta or not, perhaps not, because the NHL left down there, but here in this city, in London, Ontario, in 2018, the World Canadian Junior Champion, the World Junior Championship team, Team Canada, had an event here at a downtown hotel celebrating their win. And a young woman who's come known in the local media as EM agreed to go back to the room with one of the hockey players. And he subsequently texted his friends, and at least 8 others came into that room. She was severely intoxicated. And what came out in the news media 2 years ago is that Hockey Canada had quietly settled this at a court. Charges weren't laid. Once it hit the news media, the police have reopened it, and charges were laid this week against 4 NHL players this past week, and 1 former player. And some of the dialogue that I hear from people, I think, speaks to what you write about in this book about the myths about what constitutes real rape, because of this sort of, well, you know, what was she doing downtown? Why did she go to the room? You know, and all these things. And they even took a little 10-second video of her saying she was okay with it. Anyway, a little quote from the book. You say, sorry, yes, I just want to read this small quote from the book, because as you write, these myths often connote this: a physically violent attack on a woman by a male stranger who forced her to engage in intercourse. And you say that for you, you didn't have a word to express what had happened to you. Indeed, it did not even occur to me, you write, to try and find one, because the event seemed to defy categorization. And so, absent a word to express wrongdoing, I packaged the memory in a box and hid it in a dusty cobweb corner. You indicate that even in your response to this unremarkable event of women, including your physics major roommate, who are sexually victimized during their college years, but do not acknowledge it in so many words. 71.9% of those college students. You write, I believe there was nothing more to say about it, and so I said nothing at all. And this EM here in town fit perfectly into that category for a couple of years before finally she felt the courage to say this was, I don't know if courage is not the right word, but she was finally able to be given the space for that. So I wonder if you could describe this experience as shifting from, that embodied story to an embodied question mark you talk about. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so I think that I can't remember if this is in a footnote or actually in the text of the book, but there's this idea that if you are sort of not uh, able to kind of tell the story of your life to kind of move it forward, and when you've had a traumatic event, that's part of what happens, that story really stops. Then the traumatic event starts kind of telling you, and you really kind of lose control of your ability to live your life in a way. And so I think for me, what wound up happening was there was this tension that I wouldn't have been able to describe to you at the time, but this tension between the way that I was like physiologically responding to things happening in my world. So like I was very reactive. I would get very angry very suddenly over very things that today I'd be really surprised that wouldn't have been my reaction. So I remember being on the phone with a doctor asking for an antiviral medicine because I have a history of getting shingles and thought that I was getting shingles, and I was getting shingles. But this doctor didn't want to give me the medicine. I was supposed to get it in advance so that I wouldn't get a full-blown blast of shingles. And she didn't want to give it to me over the phone. And I got so angry. I think I may have even hung up the phone on her. And it's so beyond the way I normally would have handled a conflict like that. And so it was that, that sort of thing, and having these kind of really debilitating flashbacks and being unable to sleep. I was like convinced I was going to die in my sleep, and also having this kind of heightened startled response that was weird because it would happen when a car would pass me on the road. And so it became very difficult to imagine like driving to school because I kept thinking like I swerve when a car passes me, like this can't possibly be safe. And then just a lot of anxiety. So kind of having all these things that we associate with an anxiety disorder, with post-traumatic stress, but then feeling like there was no reason for them. So like, like I must be just kind of losing my mind, going crazy. I describe in the book as kind of self-gaslighting, and because you're falling into these scripts about or these assumptions about not, what constitutes a real sexual violation and what doesn't. So I think there was a tension between, okay, so we have these words and this vocabulary to describe what a sexual violation is. And then we have what I'm experiencing, and what I'm experiencing indicates that there's some sort of traumatic event. And but what the parameters for the traumatic event don't seem to fit me. So so there's this tension. So you say, who do I trust? Do I trust my own embodied experience of something, or do I trust what the book says is the authoritative definition of things? And like I can't even say that's what I was doing, because it really didn't even occur to me that something had been wrong. That's how much I was trusting the book definition. I just thought I was having this weird physiological unexplainable thing going on. And it really wasn't until I sort of started reassessing what the scope of harm was, and the fact that or the reality that maybe these words didn't encompass the reality of things, that I started to kind of be able to reconcile my reaction as a normal response to an unhealthy event as opposed to an abnormal response to no event at all. So that's kind of what that journey looked for me. But it took a
I bet.
very long time. And
Okay.
then
Yeah.
it took a lot of conversations with a lot of people I really trusted who were really tremendously helpful about validating that response, because I think if those people hadn't been there, my experience would have looked very different. So I do think one thing that I really benefited from was that I was in graduate school. I was studying religion, but I was also studying psychology. And so I could see in myself, oh, I'm having some kind of anxiety thing that's inexplainable. And I went to a psychology professor I really trusted, who got me into an anxiety disorder clinic that was on a sliding scale. So in the US, we pay a lot for therapy. I paid very, very little. I had a great therapist and, really ongoing support, and not a lot of people would necessarily have had that.
No.
And then I was in a school of theology, and some people have very negative experiences with faith leaders. I had very positive ones, and the things that those faith leaders said, and that my colleagues, my fellow students said, and the willingness that they had to be in conversation with me around this, I think were huge reasons why, um, those couple of years when I wasn't saying anything were pretty hard and they were very lonely. But I also eventually did get a lot of support that I think a lot of people don't get.
Good, good. I'm kind of picking up on that thread, I guess, a little bit, because the real heart of this book is about language, right? And about words. You describe words as an external source of categorization that we use to frame our understanding of right and wrong. We don't create them, we employ them. And individual words matter. Some of the most common words used to describe forms of harm that are sexual in nature are words like rape, sexual assault, and sexual abuse. Can you maybe say more about, why this analysis of these words is merited? Why is that so important to really look at these?
Yeah, so there's a chapter in the book that really takes a very, very fine-tooth comb through each of the
Yeah.
words we really commonly use to talk about sexual violations. And so, my argument is that we tend to use the word rape to describe something that we call the rape script or rape myths. And these are a set of assumptions about what rape looks like, that it involves intercourse, that it's heterosexual, that the perpetrator is a stranger, that the perpetrator is a minority, that the victimized individual is white, a cisgender woman who was not intoxicated, who was not impoverished, who was unprovocatively dressed. And these assumptions about what rape is line up with a very, very small number of actual rapes. So, up until only a couple of decades ago, there were no laws saying that rape within marriage was illegal in some places in the United States and England. I'm not sure about Canada. So there was an assumption that in that kind of relationship, you just couldn't have a rape. And we've seen that legally taken out of the books in the United States. But those are long held assumptions, and they still kind of percolate in our kind of behind the scenes non-legal understanding in our minds about rape, that this isn't something that happens between acquaintances, or it's not something that happens to gay individuals, or it's not something that happens to men. And and that there are ways that if a woman acts a certain way, she can prevent this from happening, right? If she doesn't go up to the bedroom, if she isn't drunk, if she isn't out at night. And the reality is that none of those things are ultimately going to protect you. They didn't protect me. I to the best of my memory, was sober. I was in my own space, in my own place where I lived. So, I think that there's there are these assumptions are, I think, designed to help us live in a world where we assume that we can have some degree of control over preventing harm. And so it's a really hard sell to take those buffers away, because it means admitting we're more vulnerable than we thought we are. And so it becomes easier to to blame someone making an accusation or find a reason why they're wrong than to accept that they might be right, because that then means there's something at stake for you and your own safety. So those are, some of the assumptions that are embedded in that four-letter word rape, and some of why they're there. And to some extent in the United States, sexual assault and rape are used synonymously, but then sometimes they're not. Like when I was a child, I was taught sexual assault was a form of unwanted sexual contact, but it didn't involve intercourse. Only rape involved intercourse. Now, like the FBI definition includes oral rape in its definition of rape, but again, I'm not sure that that's kind of percolated down to just the everyday ways we talk. That's our definitions are muddy around that. So, and then legally, it's in the United States, it's muddy. These definitions vary by state. So if you go looking to try to figure out what was this, if you're someone like me, like I went to look at the FBI definition, which was the old definition at the time, and I'm sitting there. The old definition had a forcible. Had the word forcible in it. I was like, well, how much force? Like, I experienced a lot of psychological coercion, very little physical force. Like, how much force do you need? Like, what counts? And I think that was, that's still kind of unclear to us. Like, the boundaries of these words are not concrete. They're not agreed upon, because our experiences are not boundaried in the way we would like them to be. And that's then made even more muddy by the terms we use legally. So that's rape and sexual assault. Then there are other words that we use, like gender-based violence. And gender-based violence, the way I describe it is, historically that was a term used to describe violence against cisgendered women. I know that individuals in the trans community and activists who support them are now using that term to describe forms of harm against any gender for any reason. I think that's a great expansion of the term. I also don't think that's how we always hear it. So if a trans individual is experiencing some kind of sexual harm and they say, I experienced gender-based violence, well, it takes the listener to share that definition for communication to be effective. And if the listener doesn't share that definition, then the communication fails. And, there can be a disbelief, hurt feelings, doubt, hurtful things said. So that's a word that just, it leaves out people, or a term that leaves out people. And then there are terms that we use legally that we just don't use in everyday life, like gross sexual misconduct, that is in one of our
It's a lot of
legal
words
statutes.
to have to say when you're
It's a
describing
lot.
it.
Exactly. It's a lot of words, and they don't necessarily mean anything to anyone outside of the legal world. So am I on the streets supposed to walk around saying I was a victim of gross sexual misconduct? Like, again, the listener, if they don't understand what you're saying, it's not very helpful. So all these words kind of, they leave people out, they leave groups out, they leave experiences out. And that's a problem both for the people who need to say something was wrong to get help, and it's a problem for the people who want to see an end to forms of sexual violations, because it means we can't create effective policies to do that.
Yeah, and I found the whole conversation in your book about where you outline all this stuff state to state, and as you say, even internationally, and the stuff about the media, and specifically here in Canada, you write about that, about how the headlines tend to favor in a way those who perpetrate the violence, at least in terms of protecting the innocents until proven guilty and so on. And you have a lot to say in the book, actually, about the collective nature of gender-based violence, rape, sexual assault. You write, human beings don't just wake up one day and sexually victimize others out of the blue. The harm inflicted in one moment of time is a result of a complex process of power-based socialization that primes some people to perpetrate harm and others to be victims of it. In fact, I think at another place in the book you say it may take a village to raise a child or raise a person, but you say it also takes a village to rape one. Can you say more about that and about, what that looks like? Because that really, I think, is an important piece of this.
Yeah. So one of the things that I regret not doing in the book is saying that there's a real theology behind this for me, which is that um, I I really subscribe to the belief that every human being is made in the image of God and that every human being is fundamentally good. And so it's a it's an impossible for me to buy in to a logic where we just call a perpetrator evil and say, well, that's just kind of who they are and who they were born to be. And therefore, this is an isolated event because that's kind of just who they are. I believe perpetrators have done bad things and made really bad choices, and they need to be held accountable for those choices and make things right. I also think that I hold that in tension with the belief that every human being is fundamentally good. And so when those bad choices happen, when we create the conditions for them to happen, for a perpetrator to believe this is a moral thing to do, that it's fine to do that, that belief didn't just come out of nowhere. That belief came from prior experiences, from prior exposure to what appropriate behavior and choices are, to prior exposure to assumptions about gender. And we're all collectively responsible for that. And, so I look and say several things. I often think the person who inflicted this harm in my life is not particularly noteworthy, only because it could have just as easily been someone else.
Right.
And there are someone else's out there. So so for that reason, I feel like emphasis on the individual, at least for my project, was less important than drawing attention to what makes all of those individuals together make the choices that they're making. And they're making the choices that they're making, I think, because, or not all of them, but I think probably many of them are making the choices they make because they believe that this is an okay thing to do, and that's because of all these other things that they've been exposed to that have allowed them to carry on with that belief in those practices.
Right. Again, maybe getting back to words and definitions a bit there. One of the things you talk about is there are varying definitions of rape, and we talked a little bit about that so far, but I thought it was interesting, you make the case that many of those definitions can be both idolatrous and, as you say, irrelevant. And I wonder if you could maybe expand on that a bit more, say more about the irrelevant and idolatrous nature of these accepted definitions, and maybe share, if you would, your definition of rape and expanding on what makes it more useful in framing that for us.
Yeah. So my my argument about idolatry and irrelevance comes from a theologian named Sally McFaig, and her belief is that she's actually not writing about rape, she's writing about language for God. And in that work that she's done about language for God, she's highly critical of exclusively masculine language for God. And exclusively is really key here. She's not opposed to male language for God. She's opposed to it being the only thing. And she says that's because it becomes too easy for us to make that language into an idol, for us to assume that the words aren't a metaphor for something that's bigger than that which we could possibly explain, right? God is so big, God is so vast and mysterious. There's never going to be a word that fully does that work. But when we only have one set of words, him, he, father, son, those those wind up becoming the way we assume things are. So we assume that God is physiologically a man. We assume that God is only able to be described as a he. And that then has an effect on how we structure, say, our faith organizations, right? We assume that
Right.
men are made more in the image of God than women are. We assume that only cisgender men can be ordained because they're somehow more like God. So she says that idolatry has very practical consequences, and so she would like to see the language expanded, so that it becomes possible for us to see the many facets of God that aren't represented in that language, but that are still part of God's self.
Right.
And so she also says that language is irrelevant because it's not representing the fullness of who God is. So it's simultaneously idolatrous and irrelevant. I find a very similar argument in the words that we have to describe sexual violations, that say the way that rape and sexual assault represent these myths about what a violation actually is that don't line up with reality. They're not the fullness of the scope of reality, right? Some people do have experiences like that, but many, many don't. Makes them into an idol. It's like the only way we're able to see things. And then there are these other terms like gross sexual misconduct that are irrelevant because they're not shared between us. They're
Right.
meaningless.
Yeah.
So I see that panning out very similarly, and so it becomes really important for me to have a, a definition that makes more space for us to describe harm in a way that actually represents the scope of it
Right. Right.
better. So the definition that I wind up using, well, actually, can I back up a minute? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
so it's probably important to say why I think it's possible to offer a new definition of rape. So and that's because the word rape hasn't always had the same meaning. So in medieval times, the first time we see that word in literature, it actually means a kidnapping. It's not sexual in orientation.
Mm.
And that idea that rape had a sexual component only appeared quite a bit later in English. So we've changed the meaning of this word before, and we've widened the scope of what it is, and we've narrowed the scope of what it is over the history of the English language. So it's not that words don't change. It's not that we can alter our understanding of them. So that's why I think it's possible to do, and why I encourage us to do it. So the definition that I offer is rape is constituted by acts of power using sex that violate agency, body, and desire. And so what I hope to do by offering that definition is to highlight power, that this is an abuse of power, but it's a particular kind of abuse of power that involves sex in some way, and that is violating in a way that affects the person's agency, that the person wasn't able to exert agency. It's an embodied act, so it affects their body, and it was not desired. So again, rape is constituted by acts of power using sex that violate agency, body, and desire.
And again, I think bang on because of the expansiveness of it. I think that is really, again, everything that you write in this book is really about expanding these words so that people know where they fit in them. Because I think too often people feel they can't speak up. And I guess that's my next question, is really about when you found your voice around this, because you write about, going a couple of years where, when you, as you said earlier, where your response to it was really in many ways somatic. I mean, and less so verbal. you write about your encounter with pastoral theologian Kirsten Leslie, and you describe what she did for you in that encounter as linguistic resistance, which I found a very interesting turn of phrase. I wonder if you could describe that encounter for our listeners a little bit, just so they get that context, focusing on how that linguistic resistance was liberative for you, and say more about how the task of linguistic resistance can have such a profound and life-changing effect for those who are victimized parties.
Yeah, so that was a really pivotal moment for me. It was probably one of, one or two moments that really had a profound shape on how I thought about my relationship to this event, how I could talk about it and live my life going forward. So had been in I had been doing some reading for class, and it was not her class. I don't remember what it was for, but I had been reading an article um, about rape for something, and it was an article that very heavily subscribed to rape myths. And Kristen um, studied sexual violence, and so I had sent her an email asking if she would talk to me about it. And so I went into her office, and she listened to my whole thing, and I think she said something like, "Is there something like else you'd like to tell me?" And at that point, I really did not. I had a very, very hard time um, talking about this because I really hadn't done so before, and I um, I like really stumbled through that conversation quite a bit, like to the extent that she really kind of had to help me at various points say what I needed to say. And she would kind of say like, "Well, do you mean this or do you mean this?" Um and so she really was a tremendous listener in that conversation. And at the end, what I said was something to the effect of like, "Look, I just don't think, like, I'm so confused because I don't know how to reconcile um, what I'm experiencing with an inability to say anything wrong happened." And she just said, "What I hear you say sounds very much like you had been raped, and like what's your response when you hear that?" And I think it's very interesting because I know I've now known her about 20 years, and in professional context, I've had the great gift to have her become a very good colleague, and she gave me permission to share this story. And I know that she herself is, um, you know, used that word in that encounter because she knew it was going to be meaningful
Mm.
and important to me, and share some of the concerns about the way we talk about rape that I do. So for her to, to turn to that word that had been such a difficult point for me because I kept saying I don't feel like I fit in to this word, but I also kind of need this word, for her to kind of say like, "No, I think the problem is with the word, not with you. Like, I take this more expansive definition, and I think something wrong happened to you," was what I describe as this act of linguistic resistance, that she was kind of using language um, as a means of support in a really uh, just transformational
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Yeah. That is the most transformative moments, I think, sometimes when
Mhm.
someone else sees the thing under the thing, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
You know what
yep.
I mean? Like, yeah, that's you were talking, but there's something under there that she could see, right?
Hmm.
And that leads me into our next question, really, because your experience and others reinforce the fact that having someone actually listen is a game changer, and especially listen over and over and over again. That
Hmm.
could be a real game changer. And you describe the experience of your initial feelings when trying to find the words as feeling like being immersed in a pile of sludge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and so you didn't know, that feeling would last forever.
Hmm.
And you also insist that the stories that we tell about rape, they do matter deeply, and having someone believe the stories is a real help to those who have suffered sexual violence. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because that certainly seems to be like I say, a game changer and something that can be very transformative.
Yeah, I think that our exposure to trauma that's not our own is often through the media and especially through TV and movies. And our TV and movie experiences have to fit into certain chunks of time, say half an
Yeah,
hour, an hour,
yeah,
2 hours, two and a
yeah,
half hours, a season. And so things get resolved efficiently, kind of quickly.
Yeah.
Someone has something that's really bothering them, and they go and tell someone about it, and then they have this sort of cathartic moment, and then they move on. And I think that that I had assumed to some extent when people said, well, one of the ways that you change your relationship to a traumatic event is by talking about it. So the philosopher Susan Bryson says saying something about a memory does something to it. And I think that's very true. Saying something about a traumatic memory does reshape how it functions in your life and your story. But that doesn't actually then mean it's in the moment a very easy thing to do, or that you just sort of immediately feel better, like at the end of a
yeah,
20-minute
yeah, exactly.
sitcom.
Yeah,
And so I think I wish someone had warned me that, like, you're going to tell this story in a lot of different ways over time. And especially at the start, like, it's just not going to feel good. It's not going to feel good when you're doing it, and it's not going to feel good when you're done. And I don't know that's everyone's experience, but I've talked with some other survivors who've said, yeah, that has been my experience for me too. Like, I didn't know. Um, and I think eventually I found a way to tell the story that felt like one that I could share, that I had some way to vocalize that was both meaningful to me and the listener, and that I could live with the feelings that accompanied it. But also those feelings changed so much with time, because that event becomes part of your past and not sort of a like reliving as you're telling it. And that shift to just was gradual. So I think, initially the sense of like, this feels crummy. Is it always going to feel
yeah,
crummy?
yeah.
Um, it it does not always feel crummy. And I think that was something also that I wish someone had said, like, this kind of sucks in the moment. It's not going to
Right.
suck forever.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
The other one of the like I went back and I reread this little section again, and I wanted to ask you about it, and I invite you and the readers to bear with me for a minute, because I'm going to read a little chunk from the book that's not out yet, so you're getting like advanced stuff here. Let's not tell the publisher, okay? But there's a little bit here, and what you're writing about is how sexual encounters are, you described them as co-written. In the book, you write, in a sexual encounter that is not violating, individuals agree to co-write a story together. Perhaps it is a story of a one-night stand or a lifelong love, but either way, each agrees to contribute to the narrative by participating in the initial encounter, which might be said to be a first draft of the story. Over time, the draft gets revised, rewritten as the participants assess and reassess its significance, so that sometimes the lover becomes a main character, while at other times the lover becomes an extra in the larger narrative structure of a life. What remains from the original encounter, then, is the agreement made on the night that each individual became part of the constructed memory of the other, so that what unites them is not simply the time spent during the sexual encounter itself, but also the commitment to be a self that includes the other person as a part of the narrative. One of the differences, you write, between a violating and non-violating sexual encounter, then, is that the victimized party is denied co-authorship, so that the person who causes the violation alone writes the key plot points, over-exerting narrative agency in a way that attempts to write the victimized person's story and have a lasting impact on that person's self. What separates those who inflict sexual harm from those who are on the receiving end of it, then, is that the latter group did not consent, irrespective of what they did or did not say during the encounter, to becoming the selves that the former tried to narrate them into being. I just find that very profound. I wonder if you can say more about this co-writing and the violation of the co-authorship that happens in a violent sexual encounter.
Yeah, so I guess one of the assumptions that's in that passage is that part of what makes us a human being is that I call it embodied stories, that we're each
Mhm.
an embodied story. And um, and we never write that story by ourselves. We didn't
No.
do it as babies. We don't do it as adults. I think it's particularly obvious when we are babies that we don't do it. People are saying things about us all the time, about what our actions mean. So, I have three young children, and when each of them were babies, I would say, what lots of mothers say, like, "Oh, look how clever, you know, this baby is," because they rolled over. Like, my baby must be really smart.
Brilliant baby.
Yeah, the only
They
baby
rolled
that
over on
ever
time.
rolled.
Exactly. And so, so you tell the story about your child, and to the extent that your child hears and absorbs that story, that starts to become who they believe themselves to be. And and that process kind of continues with your peers as you get older, right? That the influence of your parents becomes uh, less pronounced, but your peers become those people that you're co-writing that story with. So if your peer says, you're a great artist, you come to see yourself in part as a great artist and might do more art because you're getting the reinforcement for that. Uh, and so I think that we always are constructing that story of who we are in community and with others in a what an ethicist would call in a morally blameless sexual encounter. Both participants are participating in that story writing together and of their own free will. And the significance though of that story does change over time because you just don't know what comes after that event, and so you read things back into it that maybe were kind of hints of them were there, but you might not have been aware of them at the time, right? So if that person becomes your spouse, um, you might realize you gave them more of a chance than you did other people, and you now see the fact that that encounter happened at all as a recognition that there was something in you that kind of knew to stick it out with that person. So you kind of see that prior event in light of the current relationship that you have and the way that yourself continues to be constructed alongside that spouse. Um, in an encounter that that an ethicist would say is um, not morally blameless, um, there's an attempt on the part of the party exerting power to try to um, what a philosopher would say, they would try to erase the subjectivity of the other person. So um, when we talk about subjectivity in philosophy, we mean a person's ability to act as a subject, for them to exert agency. Um, and if someone is, kind of forcing you to do something that you don't want to do sexually, then that is an attempt to take that agency away and to see you not as a person, not as a subject who can do things, can exert agency, can have desires and try to fulfill them, but rather is what we would say they're treating them as an object, as a thing. And so the story is not kind of written with their agency or desires in mind. And that in turn kind of is an attempt to reshape who the self of that person is, to say that actually you don't really have a self. Like, you're not really a person, you're just this thing that can be used by me. So I think Chanel Miller, who wrote a memoir about being raped by Brock Turner, she, I think, describes this really well when she says um, uh, she was in the hospital and there was a line she had to sign in the hospital um, about being a rape victim. And she was like, but I don't want to sign that line. Like, if I sign that line, does that turn me into like I didn't consent to being a rape victim. So if I don't sign that line,
Mm.
am I not one? And so I think that's she gives a really great image for describing just what happened in that encounter, that it turned her into someone she didn't consent to be. It gave her memories she didn't want to have, an event she didn't want to have happen in her life. And so the story wasn't one that was constructed with her agency or body or desire in mind.
Right, right. There was one section of the book where you were differentiating between how someone feels about, experience of sexual violation, and then how they label that experience, and that the two are different. And you note a question raised by Nicola Gavi in her book Just Sex, and she asked, "Can a woman be raped and not know it?" And again, you write in the book, "I was such a woman. In spite of an experience that would legally meet the current definition of rape, I didn't label the event that way for several years, and in turn didn't speak about it as a violation because I didn't speak about it at all. One reason for my silence," you write, "was because of how culturally embedded beliefs used words to frame sexual violations, but that was not the only reason. Perhaps an equally powerful reason was that the words available through the setting of my life embedded beliefs and relationships that held substantial sway in my private world, but not in the culture at large, were equally unable to address what I was experiencing." Can you parse that out a bit, Danielle, and why it's so crucial to understand this and differentiate between, again, the feeling and the labeling?
Yeah. So, I think that there are a couple of things in that quotation. So one is the sense that what you're feeling in your body, the distress that you're feeling, isn't lining up with what the situation says you should be feeling. So if the situation says you should be feeling fine about your life and you're not, then, you're left saying, is the problem with me and my reaction, or is the problem with the way everyone else has constructed what is normal sexual behavior? So that's again, that's a big ask to take on for yourself, to be saying, am I more trustworthy than the words and beliefs we corporately subscribe to? So I think that's part of it. The other thing that's in that quotation is something about uh, what Carrie Doring, who's a pastoral theologian, refers to as embedded beliefs. And these embedded beliefs, they can be held by dominant culture at large, but our culture is rarely monolithic, especially in somewhere like the United States, where you have people coming from all different backgrounds, all different belief systems, all different socioeconomics, different parts of the country. This is geographically a really big country. So, so in some ways, when you say Americans believe that blank, to me, the follow-up question is often which Americans?
Which Americans? That's pretty broad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because we're not all the same. And I think that to some extent also goes for how we think about sexual violations. And so, if you're from a very conservative evangelical Christian community where women are taught to submit and obey, what is going to be considered a legitimate rape is going to be much narrower than if you are coming from somewhere in the United States where rape is believed to be sex without consent in any way, shape, or form, no matter what the relationship is between the individuals. So, and both of those Americas exist, and both of those Americas have quite a lot of power in certain parts of the country, but they're not just one of them is in America. So I think even when you think of what might be a dominant set of beliefs for Mormons in Utah versus folks who are living in Seattle, versus folks who are living in a fundamentalist Mormon compound in Texas, although I'm not sure if that compound is still even there. There's just a huge amount of variation, or I think too, of where I grew up, there were a lot of Orthodox Jewish families, ultra Orthodox Jewish families. They're called Haredi. In Brooklyn, that all of those groups are part of America, and they all have a different set of embedded beliefs about what a healthy sexual interaction is. So, so then the question in part becomes, who's right? How do we adjudicate who's right? And one thing I think is really important for us to do is to go back to how human beings respond physiologically, and what they how can I say this? What they just deserve in terms of people who have dignity by virtue of being human. So, if you don't consent to something, that is a way that you are showing that you are a subject, that you are a person who has agency and desire, and that ought to be enough to be taken seriously. And I would like to see that be more universal than it is.
Of course. I have to tell you, I had so many notes from this book. We could do like a 4-hour podcast, but no, I'd piss somebody off because they'd say, Kevin, you never shut up. We'll ask you this question as a way of closing, I guess. And I'm thinking here specifically about for those of us who follow in the way of Jesus, right? So we have, as you just noted, there are different sort of theological implications for different groups, right? As I was listening to you, I was thinking of red states and blue states, but anyway, that's another matter. But we need to be mindful, those of us who profess to follow in that way, of not only the sin that exists in God's good creation, as we understand it, but also of how God's action in the world is about restoring and renewing God's creation. Restorative justice. So you read about that. It's a topic that you speak about in the book. You highlight a case that got some national attention of a man who was found guilty of misdemeanor sexual assault and endangering a child's welfare. And you point out that this young man did not emerge from the womb as some kind of monster, right? Which I think goes back to what you were saying earlier about us believing in the Imago Dei and every person, the baptismal covenant that we all share of seeking the dignity of every human being, right? Like, what does that look like? It's important for us to be aware of the dominant culture, you write, played in the role of his actions. And you write this: the recognition that singular acts of violence, sexual wrongdoing, are not undertaken in a vacuum, change who needs to be held accountable for violations, as well as what accountability looks like. So in a situation like the one at St. Paul's, an acknowledgement of the role that the larger system played meant that this man was not only the one who needed to be accountable. I wonder if you can say more about that. And I was thinking about this in the context of the church and the many sexual violations that we've imposed upon people, and the language that we choose to use or the silence that we choose to assume, and that business of finding the words and being accountable as an institution for our actions as a body. Speak of body, and you write about that too. But it's to say more about that nature of restorative justice.
Sure. So the case that you're describing that I write about that took place at St. Paul's, I chose because St. Paul's is a boarding school. So in some ways, it's a more of a closed system than we see in other cases of sexual violations. And so you can look and a little bit more easily see how power was operating in the system, who had power and how they were exerting it. And so one of the things that came out in this case was that um, this student who had sexually violated, he was a senior, she was a freshman. Um, he was part of a group of boys at St. Paul's that kind of had like almost like a competition for how many girls at the school they were going to be sexually involved with during the year. And this was kind of well known, and the school administration didn't really do what they should have to set a culture of healthy sexual interactions between the students, or at least that's certainly what it seems to be the case. And part of it is that they didn't shut that practice down. And so you can look and see, okay, well, the student did this thing, and there were other students who were encouraging, at least at some level, this thing to occur. And there were grown-ups who, at least at some level, knew that this rhetoric was happening among the students and were not as active as they should have been about changing the tenor of the conversation around healthy sexual interactions. So here's an instance where there's a concrete act of sexual harm, but you can see that it really didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a history of a variety of individuals kind of passively turning a blind eye and allowing speech around sexual interactions. They use this language of slaying, like we're going to slay a girl. So they're allowing that speech to happen, and then presumably allowing the actions themselves to happen without anyone facing accountability for them. So I see that and say, like, okay, so we had a court case for this child, and there was a civil case against the school. But the school, on the whole, bears some degree of responsibility for this event, and in the community at large. So I see that in pretty much every sexual violation that I come across, that this didn't just come out of nowhere. There were other things that made this possible. And I do see it in the church too. We see it probably most clearly in the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, right? That if you have a history of a priest in a Catholic church being moved from congregation to congregation, and everyone knows why this priest is being moved, not only does it make it possible for that priest to engage in further harm, but it also sends the signal to other priests, you can get away with this too. Nobody's questioning this. And also sends the message to victims and people in the community. If someone comes forward, don't take them seriously because this is just the way things are, or or this person is lying because look, that priest got moved to another church and he's still a priest. So the way that our systems of power within the church enable that by not responding quickly and definitively to a harm, make that harm kind of expand in its scope beyond what it might have. I think restorative justice is not the right answer for every form of sexual harm. I think that there are perpetrators who are not capable of taking accountability for what they've done, and who are not sincerely committed to making things right for the victimized person. And that is first and foremost what restorative justice is about, is placing the needs of the victim first. So at least in the United States, when someone breaks the law and a court case goes forward, the court case isn't like me against the person who hurt me. It's the person who hurt me against the state, because the crime is a crime against the state. Right. So like what I want is to make things right is not the first need that's going to be met in that trial, the attempt to be met is for the state's view of justice to be obtained. And the state's view of justice is that if we punish someone, that is appropriate to a crime. So and by punish, I mean we give them a timeout in the prison system.
Mm-hmm.
So the prison system in the United States, as you might know, is really problematic in so many ways. We can talk about that another time. So I have substantial issues with the prison system, but I also have issues with the fact that the criminal justice system on the whole has not been kind to survivors. It has not been a place where they're believed, and their needs are not met in terms of justice because they're not even getting convictions. So so there are just so many problems with the criminal justice system with sexual harm that I think it's really important for us to look for alternatives for so many reasons. And one of the reasons I turn to restorative justice is because it starts with the assumption of making things right for the victimized party and that they get a chance to say what that means for them.
Right.
If they want, they can also engage in a conversation with the person who did the harm to find out why they did it, which for many survivors is really important. Why did you do this to me? Why? And scholars who have studied restorative justice in sexual harm more than I have found that if a person doesn't want to have that conversation specifically with that person, like they don't want to be in the room with the person, they can meet with a proxy or you know, and have the perpetrator have written answers down, or they can meet with another person who's done an act of sexual harm but not to them. So there are a lot of different ways that a facilitator can work around not wanting to work directly with the perpetrator. But my point is that that restorative justice, you know, does place those needs front and center. The other thing it does is that it tends to involve the wider community. So something like a circle process, one form of restorative justice, involves the victimized party and then other members of their community who are affected by the harm, along with the person who did the wrong and members of their community. And they all have a chance to talk about how the harm has affected them and then what they're going to do to make things right. So in something like a sexual violation where I see the whole community to some extent being complicit and needing to take accountability together, I think it's a way where you can bring more voices into the conversation. But again, it's not going to be for every case, but I think it can be for some, and it can do important things that the criminal justice system isn't doing right now.
Hey, Rob, I think, I don't know if Hockey Canada listens to our podcast or not, but they could certainly take some counsel here from Danielle on this, because I think that what you talked about is textbook what's going on about this violation that happened here in this city. Because, you know, it took the media and the corporate world withdrawing sponsorship from Hockey Canada to put enough pressure on the local police service to then reopen the investigation and for all these things to happen, because there's a culture in the hockey world, whether people want to admit it or not, of exactly as you were describing in this private school, this sort of toxic masculinity, this sort of conqueror's attitude and all this stuff. And yeah, so I just, again, everything about this book is so important. And, you know, I hope we can scheme to get you here soon.
Yeah.
Oh, me too. It would be lovely to meet in person.
Yeah, it would. It would. Again, the title of the book, Speaking of Rape, The Limits of Language in Sexual Violations. And Danielle's coming out, what do we say, March 19th? Is that the right date? Yeah. So
That's
a few
right.
weeks away.
Pre-order. You can pre-order though.
You
That's
can
right.
pre-order. That's right.
It helps
That's
the
right.
algorithm, I'm told.
Get on it.
Yeah.
Well, Danielle, thanks so much again for being part of the podcast and for giving us your time and for your wonderful work in ministry. And we'll look forward, hopefully, to seeing you in person one day.
Of course. Thank you so much.
All right. Danielle Tumminio-Hansen is the author, and again, the book is Speaking of Rape: The Limits of Language in Sexual Violations, due out March the 19th. So thanks to Danielle for being here. Thanks for our sponsors too, for supporting our podcast, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. Our thanks to the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to serve and to worship. And to Molly Maid. You can make your home a healthy haven today. Call Molly Maid London. Thanks, Kevin. Another great conversation, and we'll look forward to getting together again, I hope, next week on the Vicar's Crossing.
Next week to chat with Brian Zahn about the wood between the worlds.
All right. Looking forward to that. Thanks, everybody, for dropping by and giving us your time. And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways.
And before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vicar's Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicar's Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!